Okay, let's take a little closer look at what we might call the cultural construction of what we call crime. How is it that we come to our hegemonic, handed down to us, largely believed as just being true because everyone thinks so, definition of what crime is in our society? And typically, if you were to go out and just poll the average person, or poll the population, stand on a street corner with a clipboard asking people to describe, crime, how they feel about crime, their experiences of crime, most people in our society are going to probably focus on the topic of what we call street crime, right? Or sometimes also referred to as, interpersonal crime, individual crime, stranger on stranger crime. There's lots of different definitions for it, but typically when we think about street crime, we think about behaviors such as robbery, assault, burglary, car theft, you know, uh, interpersonal violence, assault, rape, these kind of things. When we think about it as kind of operating on the level of individuals and on the street, as it were, okay? Um, and that's pretty much our preoccupation with crime in our society, right? We typically think of crime, we tend to think of and examine the issue of street crime. And a large part of this, has to do kind of always with this idea of, what is important to individuals. And again, clearly, I'm not an individual saying that street crime is okay. I've definitely been the victim of crime myself. It's not fun. It's very scary. And sometimes, in a lot of ways, traumatizing. So I'm not trying to downplay the issue of street crime. I'm not trying to sell you if you've been the victim of crime or violence in the past. That's okay. You should forget about it, get over it, that kind of stuff. Absolutely not. But what we sometimes need to do is understand how our focus on this issue of crime, and again, remember the sociological definition of crime is violation of written down or agreed upon rules in our society, which we call laws, right? And there's lots of different examples of that. In the 1990s, there was a vast increase in media coverage of crime, okay? And it basically led our society into quote unquote believing that there was a crime explosion, right? That suddenly where there wasn't any crime in our society in the past, now we're inundated with crime, and crime is happening every single day, and it's a common occurrence, and you are likely to be the victim of crime if you step out of your house, these kind of things. We definitely know that approximately, the number of shows and news that focused on crime, street crime in particular, tripled during that period of time. And again, led to this hegemonic belief that crime was out of control. Actually, and again, this goes back to that idea of why is sociology and other social sciences like criminal justice, concerned with statistics, because we definitely know that statistics and facts sometimes refute what we think we know, common sense, right? The crime rates in the United States actually fell from the early 90s to the mid 90s, and the homicide rate rose very, very, very slightly, about from 9.3 to 9.5 per 100,000 people in our society. So again, if you look at that as a chance, you have a 9%, or much less than percent, you have a 9 chances in 100,000 of being a victim of a murder in our society in the early 90s. And that rose slightly, but that the rest of what we call street crime, other types of crime, actually fell. And so where did this concept come from? It wasn't from people's personal examples, because we know that less and less people were being the victims of crime. And that mainly came from kind of crime shows, this idea. And a popular expression that came out of news broadcasting at the time was, if it bleeds, it leads. Okay, again, if you're thinking about how a news organization is organized, let's get the people in here, let's get them watching. And this concept of, if we can show violence, if we can show blood, if we can show victimization, then we're going to lead with those types of stories. For gaining viewership, people are going to want to watch that. So we gained this kind of conceptual idea that we were under siege, right? that somehow our society was out of control. And I'm including in our viewing for this, and it'll relate to a discussion board module. The TV show Cops, one of the longest running shows of all time, basically shows kind of this reality based, right? It was we're just going to stick a camera in a cop car and they're going to follow them around, and that's going to capture what's really going on. And of course, we know that show, despite being called reality television, was very highly subject to production. That it was very carefully cherry picked as to what when you're watching Cops, you don't often just see them pulling over, an elderly grandmother for running a red light, and then nothing happens because she has her license and registration and insurance, and the police treat her very nicely and then walk away. Right? That's not going to be an episode of Cops, right? But a person who's pulled over and then acting suspicious, and then there's those drugs in the car, and then they get to pull the person out violently and slam them up against the hood, and that person resists, and then they go to the ground, or the person runs away, and there's a chase, right? So we definitely know that's going to be aired, whereas opposed to the little old lady with who ran a red light with her insurance and registration intact is not going to be on Cops, right? So it definitely emphasized drugs and violence-related crimes. And again, it didn't take into account, like I said, a representative sample of people in the society. As we know from sociological research, having a representative sample is very important. And basically focused on poor and lower class and minorities, right? Were the people who were showing up on Cops. And so our public perceptions about this concept of what crime is in our society is based on misleading and wrong information that was portrayed by the media. Again, the consequences of that are then people who stand up and say, okay, let's take a realistic look at crime and what we can do about it, are largely going to be disregarded or ignored because of these misperceptions. And a lot also, again, we're going to see some of these things have their root in the later part of the 20th century. We can talk about this idea of crime scares, specific points in our society in which misleading information led us to believe wrong things about crime in our society. And the first one I want to talk about is this concept of missing children. Again, very controversial topic and very sensitive topic. We don't like to think about children being abducted, mistreated, abused in any way whatsoever. However, we have to take a close factual look at this issue, right? In the early 1980s, we started, again, the media is often portrayed, the majority. If a child can't be found or identified, they must have been abducted. And they must have been abducted by somebody outside of their family, a stranger, right? However, statistically, we know that the majority of children whose parents report them missing are runaways. They've voluntarily left home. Again, not to say that that's a very safe behavior for children to engage in, but sometimes they're running away from abuse inside the home. We could also say that sometimes when a parent represents that a child's missing, it's because they're in a custody dispute, perhaps with the other parent in that situation, and the other parent has taken custody of that child, sometimes illegally. Again, not to say that that's always right, but that the child wasn't necessarily abducted by a stranger. However, again, there was an estimation that approximately, and this was a common statistic that was thrown around, again, largely because of media shows. Again, some of you may be familiar with America's Most Wanted, which was founded by an actor by the name of John Walsh, whose child, very unfortunately, was abducted and murdered by somebody outside of their family, a stranger abduction. And then John Walsh went on to champion this television show called America's Most Wanted, in which the idea was, okay, we're going to try to track down all these missing children. And the statistics that were thrown around in that show is approximately 50,000 children go missing every year. And if you're a parent, that's going to cause a sick feeling in your stomach. Wow, 50,000. I don't want my child to be that. And the reality of it was that in 1984, the FBI investigated 67 cases of stranger abductions in the United States. Now, that, of course, you can make the case they're not going to investigate every single But even if we take what we might call liberal or expanded ideas, that probably means there's approximately 500 to 1,000 cases of child abduction in the United States. Again, you can say that's an unacceptable number, and you would be correct, but that is a far less significant number than 50,000. And again, this leads to some issues of what we sometimes call rational prioritization. Okay, if police and investigative resources are being given over to this idea there's 50,000 children missing in our society, when the actual number, even exaggerating it, might be closer to 1,000, there's going to be a misappropriation of resources and funds. So again, we're worried about 50,000 missing children when the actual number might be closer to 1,000. We're going to be spending lots of time, effort, resources on trying to find children who are, in fact, not missing. The second thing we can talk about is this concept of, again, serial murder or serial killing, serial murderers. Again, there were many, many, many highly publicized cases of serial murder in the 1980s and 1990s. People like Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy, Jeffrey Dahmer, if you're familiar with these. You might be what we call a crime buff and know some of these very infamous names. And then again, a very popular movie at the time, which won an Academy Award, Silence of the Lambs, then spurned this kind of idea of, okay, serial killers are all over the place, right? They're living among us. We can't, there's no way of knowing who they are, but they're out there and they are killing lots and lots and lots of people. And again, for the FBI Behavioral Sciences Unit, which was founded largely at the time, estimated approximately 20% of all murders were serial murders, resulting in about 4,000 to 5,000 cases per year. So that just the fact that a FBI specific unit was saying, yeah, there's 4,000 or 5,000 serial murders being committed every year, again, led to this idea of this is happening everywhere. It's among us. There's nothing we can do about it. We don't know who these people are. And again, statistically, any murder that was committed under unknown circumstances was considered possibly to be the victim of a serial murder, okay, which is it's a fallacy, right? If a person dies and we can't point out how they died, that doesn't mean we automatically file it under being the victim of a serial murderer. However, that's what the FBI Behavioral Sciences was doing at the time. Again, at the same time, the Justice Department released a statement saying that they thought there was approximately 35 serial killers in the entire United States operating or not having been apprehended at any given time. So if you do the math, again, the FBI is saying 4,000 to 5,000 serial murders per year. The Justice Department is saying there's probably approximately 35 serial killers, people who are killing people in succession. That would mean that each killer would have to be killing over 100 people per year. Right? Which, again, if you can think about the reality of that situation, 1 every 3 days, right? That's impossible, right? For that many people, even significantly small number, 35 out of the entire population of the United States, but for 35 people to be killing 1 person every 3 days to come up with the FBI statistics is not very likely. Again, more likely is that, again, if the Justice Department is correct and there's approximately 35 serial killers in the United States at any given time, that they are probably killing 1 or 2 people per year, again, saying about 50 to 70 victims of serial killers every year, which accounts for much less than 1% of the total number of murders being committed in our society. So again, the estimation is that the chances of being the victim of a serial killer are approximately 70 out of 400 million. Okay? So clearly, when we look at those statistics, the idea of serial murder in our society is potentially not a very big problem. However, of course, the popular construction is we're given over to this concept of that it is. Again, why do these numbers? Well, clearly from the FBI standpoint, we look at this idea of the prestige increasing significantly by having this very famous and well-known in the media unit dealing with this issue. We definitely know that conservative politics at the time often pointed to this idea of crime, but especially murder, as not being a product of social conditions, but because you've got these deranged individuals running around, right? So we don't have to look at issues like poverty or inequality, lack of social welfare in our society as being an issue. We have to look at what is the moral breakdown of our society that are producing these, again, sick, deviant individuals. And again, we often look at sometimes actually the celebrity that was heaped on. Just the fact that I mentioned, 3 names at the beginning, even if you didn't know all 3 of them, chances are you've heard of at least one of them. And we go on to produce, again, movies, made-for-TV dramas, even collectibles, about these people, almost giving them kind of, like I said, folk hero status in our society. And the last thing we can think about is this idea of the drug scare. And we'll talk more specifically about this in another upcoming lecture in this module. But in 1986, we started hearing about this concept of crack cocaine. And again, cocaine has always existed in our society. I said earlier, in one iteration of Coca-Cola, it contained cocaine, the product of coca leaves. And powdered cocaine, again, really big. You could, make a case for it in the 70s, especially as a celebrity drug. This idea if you were rich and glamorous, you were snorting lines of cocaine in discos or clubs, that kind of stuff. Studio 54 being a prime example, if you've ever seen that movie. And then in 1986, a new form of cocaine called crack cocaine, which was still, again, the same substance as powdered cocaine, but definitely smoked and much less expensive to produce and easier to mass distribute, came on the scene, again, kind of plunging America into this concept of, okay, this new drug, which wasn't a new drug, it was a new form of an established drug, was going to destroy our society. In 1989, then President George Herbert Walker Bush, the elder Bush, during an election appearance, held up a bag that contained crack cocaine, which he said was purchased outside of the White House, directly in front of the White House. And of course, this threw the American public into this frenzy of, oh my God, crack's everywhere. If the president could purchase it in front of the White House, this must be endemic and everywhere in the society. The reality of the situation, the story that came out much later, is that yes, he had sent aides out to try to purchase crack cocaine. They found it impossible to find any crack cocaine in or around any of the areas of the White House, or what we sometimes call the touristy section of DC. That in fact, a teenage drug dealer had to be lured into the area, through surreptitious means, in order to purchase the cocaine. And again, if we look at the statistics, alcohol and tobacco produce many more deaths in our society than does cocaine. Again, the public perception rose from 1986. 3% of the population described drug abuse the nation's most important problem. By 1987, that number was up to 64%. Okay, so we definitely see that this, again, we're back to this kind of, and this is on both sides. I'm not blaming one political party or the other. Both, when we think about parties, both Democrats and Republicans describe this kind of moral breakdown in our society and this desire to get tough on crime. And again, not to say that my stance is all this should be, ignored, or it's not important when people are victimized by these types of behaviors, but we just need to look at not only, the reality of the situation, but also, again, looking at it from a critical constructionist point of view, and I'm quoting from the text, crime scares divert public attention away from other problems whose remedies might threaten the elite interests. Okay.